If a bowl of soup could save one life, could a ledger overturn an entire town, Sarah Holloway was about to find out. The morning bell counted 7 strikes across Cinder Creek, Colorado, though Sarah Holloway knew no children would answer its call. Late March meant planting season, and the silver mine paid boys $2 a day to haul water buckets. She'd lost her last 3 students the previous week. She set her coffee tin on the desk and counted again. 17 cents. The mercantile wanted 30 for a pound of flour. Yesterday she'd traded her mother's cameo pin for 2 eggs and a heel of bread, telling herself teaching was its own sustenance. The bread was gone now. She touched the empty place at her throat where the pin used to rest. Through the schoolhouse window, she watched the 9:15 freight wagon lumber toward Denver. The driver, Matthias, had offered her passage last month, said there were proper schools in the city, schools that paid monthly wages instead of promises. She'd refused then, clutching her letter of appointment from the Cinder Creek School Board like a land deed. Miss Holloway? Tom Brennan stood in the doorway, all 11 years and torn overalls, shifting his weight between dusty boots. His reading primer dangled from one hand. Thomas, she smoothed her skirts, ignoring the tremor in her fingers. "Have you come for lessons?" "No, ma'am. Come to return this." He set the book on her desk. "Pa says I got my letters good enough for mine work. Says to thank you kindly." She opened the primer to where they'd left off, page 43, the story about wheat harvest. His pencil marks still crowded the margins, each letter practiced until perfect. "You were passing Latin roots, Thomas. You could— $2 a day, Miss Holloway. Pa needs it for the mortgage payment." After he left, she pressed her palms against the desk to stop the room from tilting. The water barrel in the corner showed 3 inches. She'd stretched it 2 days already. Outside, the school board chairman's office sat 4 miles down the Denver road. 2 months of wages he owed her, 2 months of teaching to empty rooms. She locked the schoolhouse door and slipped the key under the loose board where she always left it. The sun marked 10 o'clock against the courthouse shadow. 4 miles was nothing. She'd walked it dozens of times. By mile marker 2, her vision started to blur at the edges. She stopped, gripping the wooden post, counting her breaths the way she'd taught the children to count their multiplication tables. The road stretched ahead, shimmering in the spring heat that had come too early this year. "Et mille marker 4 her knie spooklede." She had time to think how the packed dirt looked like a featherbed before darkness took her. The first thing she heard was a horse snorting, then wheels creaking to a stop. The sun had shifted, maybe noon now, maybe later. She tried to push herself up, but her arms wouldn't hold. "Easy there." A shadow fell across her face. Worn boots, canvas pants, the smell of wood smoke and something else, salt pork. Her stomach clenched hard enough to bring tears. "Can you sit?" She managed to nod. Strong hands helped her upright, propped her against the mile marker. The man stepped back, giving her air. He was older than her 23 years by maybe a decade. Sun weathered in the way of men who lived under open sky. A chuck wagon waited behind him, pots clanging softly from its hooks. "When do you last eat?" His voice carried a trace of Texas drawl. Pride rose in her throat, the automatic response. "This morning." But the lie died when she tried to swallow. 3 days. Some bread 3 days ago. He didn't comment, just walked to his wagon and pulled down a pot. Got a beef bone that's been simmering since dawn. Nothing fancy. "I haven't any money." Didn't ask for any. He was already building a small fire beside the road, movements efficient as a schoolroom drill. "Name's Jake Thornton. Run supplies between the mining camps." "Sarah Holloway. I teach at—" She stopped. Could she still claim to teach when her schoolhouse sat empty? "I teach." While the soup heated, he asked no questions. She watched him work, noting the careful way he measured salt, the clean cloth he used to wipe the bowl. When he handed her the soup, she forced herself to sip slowly, though her body screamed for her to gulp it down. "There's more," he said, when she'd emptied the bowl. "But best to wait a spell. Let that settle." The sun marked 1 o'clock. She could make it to town still, collect her wages, maintain her dignity. She stood, and the world tilted again. I need to reach the school board office. That'd be Carlson's place. Jake doused his fire, scattered the ashes. He left on the morning train. Won't be back for a week. Mining consortium meeting in Denver. A week. She had 17 cents and 3 inches of water. Where you headed, Miss Holloway? She looked down the road towards town, then back toward the empty schoolhouse. I don't rightly know. Jake studied her for a moment. Got deliveries to make at 3 camps between here and Granite Pass. Could use someone to handle the tallies, keeping track of who owes what. $5 for 3 days' work, plus meals. $5. More than she'd seen in 2 months. But taking it meant admitting defeat, leaving her post, abandoning the promise she'd made to bring learning to Cinder Creek. The schoolhouse will still be there in 3 days. He was already climbing onto the wagon seat. You coming or not? She looked at the primer in her hands. Tom Brennan had pressed it back into her grip as he'd left. Page 43 still waited, the wheat harvest story half past. She climbed up beside Jake, her mother's voice echoing, A lady doesn't ride with strange men, but a lady also didn't collapse from hunger on public roads. The first mining camp sprawled across Willow Gulch, like spilled matchsticks, all canvas and rough timber. Jake handled the supplies while Sarah tracked the accounts in his ledger. Her penmanship drew stares. One miner said he hadn't seen writing that fine since his mother's Bible. You really a teacher? Asked a boy who couldn't be more than Tom's age, coal dust etched into his nail beds. I am. Could you show me my name? How to write it? She looked at Jake, who nodded. Using a charred stick on a plank, she wrote, Daniel Sawyer. The boy traced it with one finger, reverent as prayer. That evening, Jake made camp beside Chalk Creek. The soup pot came out again, this time with wild onions he'd gathered and jerky from his stores. Sarah ate 2 bowls, her stomach finally unclenching. Why'd you stop? She asked. On the road. You could have driven past. Jake stirred the fire. Horses wouldn't budge. Stubborn creatures know hurt when they see it. He paused. Besides, looked like someone who hadn't given up yet. Just someone who'd given everything. The fire crackled between them. Sarah pulled out the primer, running her fingers across Tom's pencil marks. Jake watched her, then cleared his throat. I never learned my letters proper. Can read some enough for bills of sale. But writing, he shrugged. Sarah opened to page 1. Would you like to learn? The second morning brought rain, turning the mountain road to thick mud. They sheltered under a ledge, the horses stamping and steaming. Sarah had fashioned a teaching slate from a flat stone, using chalk from the creek bed. The letter A, she said, forming it carefully. Think of it like a tent. 2 poles leaning together, with a crossbeam for strength. Jake copied it, his large fingers awkward around the chalk. His first attempt looked like a broken wishbone. The second was better. My mother tried to teach me once, he said, concentration furrowing his brow. But I was always out with the cattle. Figured the land would teach me what I needed. And did it? Taught me to read weather, read men's intentions, read which streams run true and which run poison from the mines. He tried the A again, cleaner this time. Never taught me to read my own name on a deed. Had to trust the land agent's word when I bought my stake up near Granite Pass. Still wonder if he cheated me. Sarah watched him practice, this man who'd fed her without question, who'd offered work when she had nothing to trade but penmanship. She reached into her bag and pulled out the one thing she'd saved, through everything her teacher's certificate from the normal school wrapped in oilcloth. After we finished the deliveries, she said, I could stay a few extra days, teach you to read that deed properly. Jake's hand stilled on the slate. That's kind of you, Miss Holloway, but... Sarah. The rain drummed harder on the rocks above. And it's not kindness. It's what I do, what I am. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw him understand something. Not charity, not pity, but exchange. Teaching for meals, letters for shelter, each giving what they had in abundance. Sarah, then. He picked up the chalk again. What comes after A? The third mining camp squatted at timberline where trees gave up trying. Pike's Hollow, they called it, though nobody remembered Pike anymore. The sun marked 3 o'clock when they arrived. Sarah had filled 2 pages of Jake's ledger with transactions, her numbers neat as telegraph code. "Thornton!" A man emerged from the camp office, badge glinting. "About time you showed." Sheriff Dawson was all angles and suspicion, the kind of lawman who'd found his power in a place too small to matter. His eyes fixed on Sarah, cataloguing her worn dress, her place on Jake's wagon. "Ma'am." The word came out like an accusation. "Miss Holloway is handling my accounts," Jake said evenly, "making sure everything tallies proper." "That so?" Dawson stepped closer, tobacco juice staining his whiskers. "Don't recall Jake Thornton ever needing help with his numbers before." Sarah felt the ledger's weight in her lap. 2 days she'd been recording, and already she'd noticed discrepancies. Weights that didn't match, prices that shifted between camps. Someone was skimming, and Jake was taking the loss to keep the peace. "Perhaps Mr. Thornton simply appreciates accurate records," she said. Dawson's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't be that teacher from Cinder Creek? The one Carlson says has been stirring up trouble about wages? I've requested my pay, if that's what you mean. Carlson's a patient man, but even he has limits. Wouldn't want you giving Jake here any fancy ideas about what he's owed versus what he gets." Jake's hands tightened on the reins, but Sarah touched his arm lightly. She'd faced down school board bullies before. "I find that accurate accounting benefits everyone, Sheriff. Prevents misunderstandings." That evening they camped below Pike's Hollow. Jake had gone quiet since the encounter with Dawson. Sarah prepared their simple meal. She'd learned his routine now, the precise way he liked the coffee grounds settled. "You saw it," he said finally. "In the ledger." "The missing quantities?" "Yes." "Dawson takes his cut. All the suppliers pay it, or they don't supply." Jake stared into the fire. "Been that way 3 years now. Have you ever challenged it?" "With what?" "Can't prove numbers I can't read. Can't file a complaint I can't write." His voice carried old frustration. "That land deed I mentioned? Starting to think Dawson might have played a part in that too." Sarah pulled out the primer, but this time she turned to the back to the section on legal documents she used to teach her older students. "Show me your deed." Jake retrieved it from his wagon, wrapped in the same oilcloth she used for her certificate. By firelight, she walked him through each line, sounding out the words he couldn't parse. When they reached the boundary description, his face went dark. "That's not right. Says here 50 acres. I paid for 200. Can you prove what you paid? Have the bank draft somewhere, but I can't." He stopped, frustration evident. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, "after we finish at Granite Pass, we'll write a proper claim letter together." That night she woke to voices. Dawson and 2 men stood at the edge of their camp, horses snorting in the darkness. "Thornton, we need to talk about your new bookkeeper." Jake was already up, positioning himself between the men and Sarah. "Nothing to talk about." "See, that's where you're wrong. Miss Holloway here has a reputation for not knowing when to leave well enough alone. Wouldn't want that tendency to rub off." Sarah stood, the primer still in her hands from their evening lesson. "Sheriff, are you threatening Mr. Thornton?" "Warning him. There's a difference." Dawson spat tobacco juice near the fire. "You got 1 more delivery tomorrow. Make it, then move along, both of you." After they left, Jake rebuilt the fire in silence. Sarah noticed his hands shaking slightly. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've brought you trouble." "Number." His voice was firm. "Trouble was already here. You just gave it a name it can't spell." The next morning came raw and bright. Granite Pass, the final camp, perched above a played-out mine. The foreman there, an older man named Wilhelm, greeted them warmly. "Jake!" "And who's this?" "Miss Sarah Holloway. She's helping with the accounts." Wilhelm's eyes brightened. "The teacher from Cinder Creek? My grandson Tommy mentioned you, said you taught him to read Latin." Tom Brennan's grandfather. Sarah felt the world shift into place. He was an excellent student. Still is when he's not hauling water. Wilhelm's face creased with regret. "Wished we could keep him in school, but the mortgage—" While Jake unloaded supplies, Wilhelm pulled Sarah aside. "Is it true what Tommy says? You've been teaching without pay? The board promised many things. Carlson's been collecting school taxes for 2 years, but somehow the teacher's salary never materializes. He lowered his voice. There's a group of us been talking. Parents who want better for our children. If we could find a teacher willing to work with us directly. I have a contract with the board. A contract they haven't honored. Wilhelm pressed a folded paper into her hand. Think about it. The paper was a petition, 12 names already signed, promising $2 monthly per family for a teacher who'd commit to staying through winter. $24 a month more than the board had ever promised. On the ride back towards Cinder Creek, Jake was teaching himself to write his full name. His letters were becoming steadier, more confident. The sun marked 4 o'clock. You're going to take their offer, he said. It wasn't a question. I haven't decided. Sarah. He'd started using her given name naturally now. It's good money, decent people. Why hesitate? She watched the road unfold, each mile bringing them closer to her empty schoolhouse. Because taking it means admitting, I failed. That I couldn't make the proper channels work. Or it means you succeeded in spite of them. They were approaching mile marker 4, where she'd collapsed 3 days ago. Jake stopped the wagon without her asking. She climbed down, stood at the spot where she'd fallen. The earth showed no sign of it, already blown smooth by prairie wind. I have something for you, Jake said. He handed her a small leather journal, the kind he used for his ledgers. For your teaching records, the real ones, not the ones the board ignores. She opened it. On the first page, in his careful new script, he'd written, Property of Miss Sarah Holloway, teacher. Jake. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, moving fast. As it grew closer, they recognized Dawson and his men riding hard from town. But they weren't alone. Carlson was with them, his city suit incongruous on horseback. Thought you might try to sneak back, Carlson called out, reining up sharp. Heard you've been making promises to miners' families, undermining the board's authority. Sarah felt Jake tense beside her, but she stepped forward. I've made no promises. Only listen to parents who want their children educated. You work for the board, Miss Holloway. Your contract, my contract promised wages. Where are they, Mr. Carlson? His face reddened. The town's finances are complex. You wouldn't understand. Try me. She pulled out Jake's ledger, 2 days of meticulous records. I understand numbers quite well. For instance, I understand that 12 families paying $2 each equals $24 monthly. Strange how that exact amount appears in the school tax collection records, yet never reaches the teacher. Dawson's hand moved toward his pistol. You calling Mr. Carlson a thief? I'm calling him accountable. Jake stepped down from the wagon, movements deliberate. Seems like Miss Holloway is not the only one interested in accountability. Been teaching me to read my own papers, Sheriff. Interesting what a man discovers. The air went tight. 4 men against 2, and Sarah with nothing but a ledger and a primer for weapons. The sun dropped lower, casting long shadows. Then Wilhelm's voice rang out. Everything all right here? He came over the rise with 6 other men, all parents from the camps, Tom Brennan's father among them. They arranged themselves quietly behind Jake's wagon. Carlson's horse danced nervously. This is town business, Wilhelm. Education's everyone's business. We've decided to hire Miss Holloway directly, private tutor for our children. She has a contract which you've broken. Wilhelm held up a paper. We've consulted with a lawyer in Denver. Failure to pay wages voids the agreement. Sarah saw the moment Carlson realized he'd lost not just the confrontation but his leverage. A teacher who worked for the families couldn't be controlled by withholding board wages. You do this, he said to Sarah, and you'll never teach in a proper school again. I'll make sure of it. She thought of her empty schoolhouse, 17 cents in a coffee tin, Tom Brennan's pencil marks in the margins. Then she looked at Jake, still practicing his letters every spare moment, and Wilhelm's group, men who worked themselves raw to give their children better. I'm already teaching in a proper school, Mr. Carlson. It just doesn't have walls. The sheriff pulled Carlson's horse around. Come on, nothing illegal here, just folks making arrangements. As they rode off, Sarah's knees nearly buckled again, not from hunger this time, but relief. Jake's hand steadied her elbow. "Where will you teach?" he asked. Wilhelm answered, "Grange Hall in summer, Bowers Barn in winter. We'll make it work. And I'll handle supplies," Jake added quietly. "Books, slates, whatever's needed. Part of my regular route." Sarah looked between them, these men who'd shown up when it mattered. "I'll need 2 weeks to organize. Set up a proper curriculum." "Take 3, Wilhelm said. "We want this done right." 2 weeks later, the Grange Hall overflowed. Sarah counted 23 children and half as many parents, all crowded into a space meant for 10. Tom Brennan sat in the front row, his primer open to page 44 past the wheat harvest story at last. The morning sun marked 8 o'clock through the east window. Sarah had arrived at 6 to prepare, arranging borrowed benches, hanging the alphabet chart Jake had helped her paint on canvas. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to establish our rules." She wrote them on the board Jake had built from salvaged timber. 1. Everyone learns. 2. Older helps younger. Sand. Questions are welcome. 4. Books travel home. "Miss Holloway." A small girl raised her hand. "My pa can't read. Can he come too?" Sarah caught Jake's eye where he stood by the door. He'd been practicing every evening, could now read most of the primer and write basic correspondence. His presence here was no secret. Half the camp knew he was learning his letters. "Anyone who wants to learn is welcome," Sarah said. The door opened wider. 3 miners entered, caps in hand, coal dust still etched in their faces despite their Sunday clothes. Behind them, 2 women with babies on their hips. "We can only come evenings," one miner said. "After shift. Then we'll have evening sessions, too." The room stirred. This was more than they'd discussed, more than the petition covered. Sarah saw Wilhelm start to speak, probably about money, but Jake cut him off. "I'll sponsor the evening sessions. Call it an investment in literate customers." By 9 o'clock, Sarah had divided the students into groups. The youngest traced letters in boxes of sand Jake had prepared. Tom's group parsed Latin roots on slate tablets. The adults worked through the primer's first pages, Jake helping when Sarah was occupied elsewhere. Then Dawson walked in. The room went silent. He stood in the doorway, badge catching light, hand resting on his pistol. "This is an unlawful assembly." "It's a school," Wilhelm said. "Nothing unlawful about education. The Grange Hall's not zoned for educational purposes. You need board approval for any school in this district." Sarah felt the familiar tightness authority using technicalities to maintain control, but this time she wasn't alone. "Sheriff," Jake said, standing slowly, "might want to read the actual ordinance before making accusations." "You telling me the law, Thornton?" "No, sir. Just suggesting you read it." Jake pulled out a paper, handling it carefully. Section 4, paragraph 2, says any building can be used for educational purposes if it's private instruction, not public schooling. Dawson snatched the paper, eyes scanning. His face darkened as he realized Jake was right, and more importantly, that Jake could read well enough to know it. "Where'd you get this?" "Copied it myself from the town records. Miss Holloway taught me how." Jake's voice carried quiet pride. "Amazing what a man can learn when someone believes he's capable." The room held its breath. Dawson crumpled the paper, tossed it at Jake's feet. "This isn't over." After he left, the children slowly returned to their work, but the adults remained tense. Sarah knew Dawson would return, probably with Carlson, definitely with more threats. "We need witnesses," she said, "official ones. People whose word carries weight beyond Cinder Creek." Wilhelm nodded. "The railroad commissioner's due next week. Denver newspaper sometimes sends a man with him. Then we'll give them something to witness." She assigned the older children a project. Write letters about what learning meant to them. The adults would practice reading them aloud. Not a performance, but testimony. That evening, after the students left, Jake helped Sarah clean the hall. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that had developed over their days on the road. "You know Dawson won't give up," he said. "I know. Could get ugly. Might be safer if you—" "If I what? Run? Find another empty schoolhouse in another town that won't pay?" She shook her head. "I'm done running, Jake." He studied her, then pulled out his journal, the one he'd bought to practice writing. "Want to show you something?" Inside, he'd been writing more than practice letters. He'd documented everything. Dawson's skimming, Carlson's theft, the intimidation tactics. His handwriting was still uncertain, but the facts were clear. "Evidence," he said simply. "In case we need it." Sarah touched the pages, understanding what this meant. Jake had given himself the power to fight back, and he'd done it with the tools she'd taught him. "There's something else," he said, quieter now. "That land up at Granite Pass, my 200 acres? Been thinking about building a proper schoolhouse there. Would need a teacher, of course." Before Sarah could respond, Tom Brennan burst through the door. "Miss Holloway, Sheriff's at your old schoolhouse. He's got men with him, and kerosene." They ran. The sun had dropped behind the mountains, leaving everything in blue shadow. By the time they reached the schoolhouse, half the town had gathered. Dawson stood with a torch, Carlson beside him. "Buildings condemned," Carlson announced. "Structural deficiencies." "That's a lie," Sarah said, pushing through the crowd. "You're not the authority here, Miss Holloway." Carlson held up a paper. "Official board decision." Sarah saw her teaching materials through the window, the books she'd bought with her own money, the charts she'd painted, Tom's primer still on the desk. "Wait," Jake stepped forward. "Let her get her belongings first." "Property of the school board," Dawson said. "Everything inside. Even personal items?" Jake pulled out his journal, pencil ready. "Want to make sure I document this correctly for the Denver newspaper. They're always interested in how small towns handle property rights." Dawson hesitated. The crowd had grown miners, families, even some town merchants who'd remained neutral until now. 5 minutes, Carlson said. "Personal items only." Sarah went inside alone. She gathered what mattered, her certificate, the new journal Jake had given her, and yes, Tom's primer. But as she lifted it, she found something underneath a folded paper she hadn't seen before. It was a deed, Jake's original deed, the real one, showing 200 acres. A note was pinned to it. "Found this in Dawson's office. Thought you should have it. A friend." She understood immediately. Someone in Dawson's own circle had turned. The evidence Jake needed was right here. Outside, she handed Jake the deed quietly, then faced the crowd. "Mr. Carlson's right. This building belongs to the board." Her voice carried clear in the evening air. "But education doesn't live in buildings. It lives in people willing to learn, willing to teach, willing to stand up for what's right." She pulled out one of the children's letters written that morning. "May I read this before you burn the building? It's from Annie Sawyer, age 8. Carlson started to object, but voices in the crowd called out, "Let her read." Sarah's voice was steady. "Learning to write means I can send letters to my grandmother in Missouri. She thinks I'm still a baby. Now I can tell her I'm big." She read another, then another. Tom Brennan stepped forward and read his own, about wanting to know more than just mine work. Jake read his, simple and powerful. 40. 3 years I signed with an X. Now I sign my name." The crowd had gone quiet. Even Dawson's men looked uncomfortable. Then the railroad commissioner's carriage rolled up a week early. Beside him sat a thin man with a notebook, the Denver newspaper correspondent. "What's the occasion?" the commissioner asked, surveying the scene. Wilhelm stepped forward. "We're witnessing the difference between education and control, Mr. Commissioner." The correspondent's pencil was already moving. "Is it true the town board withheld teacher wages while collecting school taxes?" Carlson went pale. "That's a complex situation." "Seems simple enough," Jake said. He showed the correspondent his journal, the documentation clear even in the failing light. "Also might interest you to know the sheriff's been modifying land deeds." Sarah watched Dawson's hand twitch toward his gun, but the crowd pressed closer. These weren't outsiders, these were his neighbors, the people he'd have to face every day. "Burn it if you want," Sarah said to Carlson, "but know that tomorrow 23 children will still show up to learn. If not at the Grange, then in someone's kitchen. If not with these books, then with charcoal on bark. You can't burn the desire to learn." The commissioner cleared his throat. "Mr. Carlson, I think we need to discuss the district's educational funding tonight." As Carlson and Dawson were led away for questioning, the crowd dispersed slowly. Some patted Sarah's shoulder, others nodded to Jake. The schoolhouse still stood, for now. Jake found Sarah sitting on the steps, Tom's primer in her lap. "You all right?" She looked up at him. "That deed your land. You can fight for it now." "Already am. Wilhelm's brother is a lawyer. Says with the documentation. It's a clear case." He sat beside her. "That offer still stands. About the schoolhouse on my land. Jake, not charity, business proposition. You'd teach the local children. I'd handle supplies and transportation. Fair partnership," Sarah considered. "A real school, purpose-built, on land that couldn't be taken away by corrupt boards. Equal partners?" "Equal." He held out his hand, calloused from years of work, but steady now from weeks of holding a pencil. She shook it, feeling the future settle into place. 6 months later, Sarah stood in front of the new schoolhouse on Jake's land, their land now. After a brief courthouse wedding that had more to do with legal protection than romance, though both admitted the partnership had grown into something deeper. The building was simple but solid. 3 rooms, real windows, a bell Jake had salvaged from an abandoned mine. Tom Brennan had helped paint the sign. Granite Pass Free School. The first snow was falling. Fat flakes that would close the mountain passes by nightfall. But inside, the potbelly stove Jake had installed kept everything warm. 28 students worked at their lessons, ages 6 to 60. The evening class had grown to include a dozen adults, some traveling from as far as Pikes Hollow. Sarah watched Jake teaching a group of younger children their letters, his patience with them the same he'd shown with frightened horses. He'd learned to read his deed, write his contracts, and discovered he had a gift for teaching arithmetic. All those years of calculating supplies had prepared him well. Tom Brennan, now her assistant for the younger grades, in exchange for advanced lessons, was helping his grandfather with Latin texts they'd ordered from Denver. The correspondence article had brought donations, books, slates, even a small stipend from a reform-minded philanthropist in the capital. "Miss Sarah?" Annie Sawyer tugged her skirt. "I mean, Mrs. Thornton?" my grandma wrote back. Sarah read the letter with Annie, sounding out the harder words together. Through the window she could see the empty Cinder Creek schoolhouse in the distance. Carlson had lost his position after the investigation, Dawson had fled to California, and the new board had offered Sarah triple wages to return. She'd declined. That schoolhouse had taught her something valuable. Education didn't need permission from people who saw it as control. It needed only willing hearts and stubborn hope. Jake caught her eye across the room and smiled, the expression still rare enough to warm her more than the stove. He'd written something on his slate, held it up for her to see. "Partner," she wrote back on her own. "Teacher." He amended his. "Partner, teacher, mine." She amended hers. "Teacher, partner, yours." The snow continued falling, blanketing the world in fresh possibility. Sarah rang the brass bell not to summon students, but to mark the moment. Every head lifted from their work, and in that pause she saw it clearly. The harvest she'd nearly died trying to plant. Not in the building that had rejected her, but here, in the place where soup and kindness had saved her. "Back to work," she said gently, and the scratching of pencils resumed, each mark a small rebellion against those who'd say some people didn't deserve to learn. Outside, the chuck wagon sat under a lean-to Jake had built, the same pot that had held her salvation, now serving lunch to students who walked miles for their lessons. Some things, she'd learned, were worth the hunger that brought you to them. Some things were worth the falling, if it taught you how to stand. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.